we're in this repetitive cycle that can actually be broken, not by waiting for a bank or someone to write a check or for a superhero from outer space to come and save us, but by really listening to ourselves and our own history and resolving ourselves to the wealth which is already embedded in community. And so that's a big part of what we're working on. But I feel like we all know this is true. And so really need a way to really step into that more fully, because I do believe that we have the answers right at our fingertips, and just need to believe it and step into it.
I'm Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I'm delighted that you've joined us for this evening's program, Upward Mobility in Boston, 50 years after busing. This is our third and final program in our series examining the lasting impacts of the 1974 landmark decision to desegregate Boston public schools. We have a terrific panel this evening that will explore upward mobility in Boston, looking at the city's historic institutional roadblocks that have hindered progress for people of color 50 years after busing. The panel will explore solutions to address these persistent issues, such as embracing educational opportunities, closing the educational, looking at enhancing educational opportunities, closing the wealth gap, and looking at home ownership and broadening access to job opportunities. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize the evening's other sponsors, the GBH Forum Network, the Boston Housing Desegregation and Busing Initiative, and of course, GBH Forum Network, the Lowell Suffolk Moakley Institute and Archive. And I'd like to thank the Lowell Institute, whose generous funding makes programs like this possible. And to our audience, of course, thank you for being here this evening. So we're delighted to welcome Kris Hooks as our evening's moderator. And I can't think of a better moderator to host this evening's conversation. Kris is the editor-in-chief of the Boston Globe's newsroom team, Money, Power, Inequality, which focuses on the racial wealth gap in Greater Boston. The team's mission is to investigate how decades-old institutional roadblocks still hinder upward mobility for people of color, despite recent attempts to bridge the gap. This initiative started in the late fall of 2023 and has published some really wonderful, thought-provoking reporting since its inception. And I really encourage you all to read some of the reporting of this team's efforts. And so, Kris, I welcome you with open arms. Thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this evening's panel. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you for such kind words, Susan. I appreciate it. Welcome everyone to tonight's panel. I just want to start with introducing everyone who we have here today. Starting with Dr. Karilyn Crockett, an assistant professor of urban history, public policy and planning at MIT. She earned her Ph.D. from the American Studies program at Yale University, a Master's of Science in Geography from the London School of Economics, and a Master's of Arts and Religion, from Yale Divinity School. Her research focuses on large-scale land use changes in the 20th century American cities and examines the social and geographic implications of structural poverty. Her dissertation, People Before Highways, Reconsidering Routes to and from Boston, from the Boston Highway Movement, investigates the 1960s era grassroots movement to halt urban extension of the interstate highway system and forms the basis of her book of the same name. She previously served as the Director of Economic Policy and Research and Director of Small Business Development for the City of Boston, and most recently served as the city's first Chief of Equity. Also want to introduce Dr. Tatiana Cruz, a Boston native and Assistant Professor and Director of Africana Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Simmons University. She is also the founding co-director of North Star Collective, a regional consortium of colleges and universities committed to racial equity and uplifting BIPOC faculty. Her research interests include African American and Latinx history, social movements, race and ethnic studies, oral history, urban history, and women's and gender studies. She's currently completing a book titled Deep North Uprising, African American and Latinx Identity, Community, and Protest in Boston, and has published in the Journal of Urban History, the New England Quarterly, and is a forthcoming chapter in an edited collection called Black Movement, African Americans, Cities, and Post-Black Power America. She received her BA from Williams College and MA and PhD from the University of Michigan. And last but not least, we have Ron Bell, who is a civic engagement and voting rights organizer in Boston with a track record of developing the infrastructure of public participation and community in government. He is the founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Dunk the Vote, which has registered over 100,000 voters in Massachusetts since 1992. He has built a career in bringing innovative, results-driven approach to citizen self-advocacy, leadership training and education, political campaigns, and justice-focused coalitions. He is a former senior advisor for community affairs for former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick, and has served on many campaigns at the state and citywide level. He has completed fellowships at Harvard's Kennedy School and the MIT Media Lab. He received President Clinton's Point of Light Award and serves as an advisor and board member for several organizations focused on educating the leaders of tomorrow. He is also an anchor, broadcaster, Boston Black News. So all of that to say, we have a load of great panelists here tonight, who all of whom have incredible expertise. So let's get started. This summer, as a lot of you already know, because you were here, marks 50 years since Judge Garrity's decision to force Boston to desegregate its schools, which, as we all know, came in the form of busing. Garrity's decision eventually pushed Boston's persistent issues with racism into the national spotlight. Video and photos from the time show Black students being attacked on the way to school, white residents hurling racist language at Black children, and Black Bostonians rightfully upset by it all. Ask anyone who knows those who experienced it and those who research it, and they will likely say that court-ordered busing did not work. And quite frankly, it wasn't even what Black parents and activists at the time fought for. They simply wanted better schools, better education for their children and future generations. So tonight, I want to start with Ron. You experienced growing up in Boston. You experienced busing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
First, I just want to start out by saying I'm glad to be a part of this distinguished panel because this is a very important topic, but it's also very difficult. What gives me hope to continue the work that I've been doing over the last 30 plus years is what happened on Saturday at MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning, led by Dr. Karilyn Crockett and advisors, activists, community leaders, young people, students, Black, white, Latino, everything in between. So that gives me hope to be able to even do this panel and be a part of it. But I will say that it's just as encouraging to be able to tell our story. I was born in Boston, grew up in Boston's Mission Hill, lived in 10 of the 24 neighborhoods and counting. And so I can talk about the city of Boston from my lens. 1974 is when, they started the phase one of busing. And 1975, I was a young person at the Farragut School where I was able to walk 2 blocks to go to school. And it was a tumultuous time because we heard about in 1974 the bomb threats at Hyde Park High School and the things that happened at South Boston. So as a young child coming from the Mission Hill and to be bused in Brighton, we didn't even know what busing was. You know, we didn't know what Brighton was. And so it was just very hard for us because we were fearful this may happen to us. Although Brighton was a school, was a neighborhood that was more welcoming because you had the Fidelis Way projects and you had Black people, very diverse community. But just hearing what happened in Charlestown and Hyde Park and other neighborhoods to people that I grew up with in the city of Boston. 1976, I went to the Thomas A. Edison School. No, 1975, I went to the Thomas A. Edison School, and I had a Black teacher. His name was Mr. Lee. I was in 6AA, and that was supposedly the smart kids, right? And you to go through that experience of him preparing me for school, preparing me for college. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was a Black man teaching us. 1976, I got accepted into the first public school in North America, Boston Latin School. And I didn't want to go because you was hearing about what was happening in other neighborhoods in the city of Boston as far as the racial tension. 1976, during busing, I was very afraid as a young child. And I have to give kudos to Jim Vrabel, whose son used to play for me at the Tobin Community School, Lou Fenfer, and I know Karilyn Crockett, and he works on a project with busing and desegregation and so forth. And I was really stunned by the timeline that they put together and kind of lined it up with my life. And in 1976, during busing, because it was a tumultuous time, racial tension was very high. And I remember in the 7th grade that a teacher called me the N-word. I did not want to go to Boston Latin, although I had a mother that wanted me to finish this because she knew it would be beneficial. And so when I think about what Black children went through, what everyone went through, it was just a difficult moment in our life, and it was hard. I remember the tension that went on in South Boston. Growing up in Mission Hill, it didn't really happen in my neighborhood. Again, I walked 2 blocks to my elementary school, and my neighborhood was mixed, Black, white. Didn't really see too many Latinos at that time. And I know Sister Tatiana will talk about that more, but it was just a time in our life that we were really like children, we're afraid. And so in Boston Latin, being called the N-word, I remember times of fire alarms being pulled at Boston English, which is predominantly Black, right across from Boston Latin. I remember being in a school predominantly white, fire alarm be pulled Boston Latin, Boston English, and we would go out, meet with most of my friends, and I had to go back in with the white kids. So that was difficult. So the division in Boston really transitioned into the high schools, the neighborhoods, even in my neighborhood. As a young kid during busing, we didn't go in various neighborhoods. In Mission Hill, very much, there were many sub-neighborhoods. You had Mission Park, you had Top of the Hill, Alice Taylor, you had Mission Main. And I remember as a young boy going to Cub Scouts, being spit on by white boys. So that is very traumatic. So when we talk about desegregation, there are many people that experienced it. They are hurting. I was talking to some people that this panel was going to happen. They didn't want to listen to it. And so this is hard for us to relive these moments in our history. And so as we move forward, I thought about my mentors, Huey Jones and Mel King, and I know Karilyn and I share some of the same mentors. They were involved in the movement ever since the 60s. Dr. Virgil Wood, who's one of my mentors. Jim Vrabel, I coached this kid. Lou Finford, one of my mentors. So it's very hard for us to really relive these moments. So I stand here today to represent the city of Boston, not from what I read, not from what I heard, but what I've lived.
Thanks, Ron. I want to, you mentioned the 60s. I want to sort of talk a little bit about the fights that led up to what ultimately became desegregation. Some of the racial tensions that happened well before desegregation. The freedom schools in the 60s. Dr. Crockett, you've written books on, you've studied urban renewal and highways. One book, I'm sorry, your dissertation that led to a book on urban renewal and highways. And we see a lot of white flight that also happened leading up to it as well. So I want to sort of talk a little bit about that, everything that sort of led up to the tension and the creation that ultimately became desegregation and busing.
Sure. Thanks, Kris. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to be here on this incredible panel with just so much admiration for Tatiana and Ron. It's not even funny. So really appreciate the chance to be here. I think that if we're counting numbers in years, we're talking about not really 50 years, but we're talking about many more years back. But if we had to call a year out, I would say we're talking about the 70th year anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And so if we allow ourselves to be reminded that it was the Brown decision in 1954 that really broke the yoke of legal segregation in schools. And so what it means to really set our sights on a national struggle, in some respects, even an international struggle for human rights, recognition of Black folks in this country in terms of having access to their constitutional right to education. That is what we're talking about, a much longer wave of history, a much longer constitutional and human rights fight that we are situating ourselves in. And that absolutely begins with even before the founding of the country, when the land was ripped from Native Americans here and in the work to identify what are rights, who has entitlements as people on this land, who has entitlements as people who are kidnapped from other lands and brought here. And so that's the larger struggle that continues. And so the history of discord, the history of fight around rights, around land, around space and opportunity and legal protection is not something that we can say is 50 years old. It's definitely not something we can say is 70 years old. It is a multi-generational, multi-century struggle for personhood in this country. And so when we think about the specificity of busing itself, it suggests a very limited understanding of what it would take to bring people into full personhood, into full recognition before the law. And so it is especially meaningful for me because my grandmother, Mary Ann Crockett, was one of the original plaintiffs in the Tallulah Morgan case. And I know that in 1954, my grandmother was 16 and in high school herself in Excelsior, West Virginia, which is where my family is from. My family represents a really proud multi-generational legacy of coal miners in Southern West Virginia. And so some of what they experienced as people who were in a very hard landscape, working on coal mining, for my family, education was everything, very important. And even from my great-grandfather, who had been a coal miner, and his father, my family was originally in South Carolina and were subject to the Negro codes, which made it illegal for Black people to read and write. And so my great-grandfather, being taught to read by his father, was an illegal act. And so for my family, literacy and education has always been more than just doing well in school. It's always been about more than that. It has been about understanding our very survival in this country and trying to find a pathway from enslavement to post-emancipation, to coal mining to the north. And so I frame it that way because many of us represent families that have been in a state of movement and flight, moving to from bondage in many different ways to freedom, to access, and still are in movement. And so when we talk about 1974 in Boston, we're talking about a very particular moment of extreme and heated fight for not just access to schools, but access to the power to define yourself, to define your own community, and to your rightful protection by the laws of this country, and for your rightful protection and access, not only by access to education, but again, the protection of the law. And so what does it mean to say that we will no longer be denied access to education, which is rightfully our own, when the courts have said so? And so this is telling us quite a lot about the serious resistance, not just by people and neighbors, but by systems like the Boston School Committee that was sued by my grandmother and other mothers, the incredible representation by the NAACP and others who really stood in the gap when the city and the powers that be in the city would not allow people again to have access to what was rightfully theirs. So I'm not sure this totally answers your question, Kris, but just trying to put into context a much longer set of fights and struggles that are not just about being in a classroom, although that's a crucial piece of it, that there's a much longer struggle for human rights and civil rights that so many of our families have been engaged in and continue to be. And so we're clearly not there yet. And so I appreciate the chance to historicize a little bit, but this is a very immediate and urgent issue for us today. So it's not just about looking backward and commemorating something, but really asking ourselves some hard questions about what are we willing to do to get this right, because we still need to.
I want to talk about today, actually, not specifically this day, but our current point in time. So we are at this point, looking at a Boston public school system that is a majority Black and Latino, and a majority of, quite literally, is Latino. Only 15% roughly of Boston public schools is white. Some of the issues that Judge Garrity pushed for in terms of hoping for what desegregation would ultimately lead to, we can't necessarily see some of those things today in terms of desegregation. A lot of the issues now that we see are, a failure, quite frankly, of a system to educate Black and Latino students. And one of the things that is often left out and missed, both today and in history of desegregation and busting, is the Latino voice. Tatiana, I know you have studied a lot about this, and I want to open the floor to you to give some of your thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Kris. And thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with Ron and Karilyn in this space. So as a panelist of a different generation, I can't share my experience, through the movement as Ron did. My family didn't arrive in Boston until 1971. And I wasn't born until the 80s. So for me, as a historian, I've been really interested in understanding, kind of unpacking my city and what it means to be Latina in what's framed as largely a Black and white space. And the history of Latinos organizing for educational justice really mirrors that of African Americans. So the long history, there's a long history of African American organizing, and I encourage you to check out my colleague's book. Zebulon Maletsky might be here. has a great book called Before Busing. But there's a long, long history. And if you think even kind of post-war, there's a history of African Americans organizing, advocating for better schooling in terms of like moms going and monitoring their kids' schools and fighting with principals and doing kind of real grassroots organizing, deciding to take their kids and move them to other schools where they will have better opportunities. And then we have the creation of all these independent schools, Black-run schools. There's the creation of all kinds of programming, like if you think of Operation Exodus and Metco, all of those where Black parents were opting out of Boston schools because they weren't doing well, or they were moving their kids to white schools in Boston. The Latinx movement really mirrors the same thing in terms of the same values and strategies of self-determination and community control. What's interesting is that the Latino population was largely racialized similarly to African Americans. They lived in the same segregated places, mostly, at the time, if you think the 60s and 70s, mostly the South End and Roxbury. And because they dealt with the same kind of housing discrimination and such, they were often in the same segregated schools as African Americans. And because of this, they faced the same problems that all of these schools face, these segregated schools face. They were underfunded, they didn't have enough resources, they were overcrowded, they had racist curriculums. The difference was for Latinx children, who most were recent migrants from Puerto Rico at the time, the population was largely Puerto Rican. They also had the problem of language. As non-native English speakers, there was nobody that could teach them. And what they found was that there was this great study that came out. Ron, you mentioned Hugh B. Jones. Hugh B. Jones, in leading the Roxbury Multi-Service Center, led this great coalition that published this wonderful report called the Task Force on Children Out of School. And what they found in 1970 was that basically half of the Latino population's children were actually excluded from schools. So they were excluded from schools if they didn't know English, if they had, there was a teenage pregnancy, at that time they were arbitrarily branding people as unteachable and all kinds of problematic developmental disabilities that we later found were not that. But essentially what they found was that Latino children were just out of school and were just at home and not going to school. Increasingly, though, Latino parents organized and very much took cues from the African-American community. Latina mothers in particular started creating their own English programs to teach children English. They had migrant programs, and eventually they lobbied and helped create the bilingual ed programs. So the bilingual education programs in Boston started in 1969, and then they lobbied to get the Transitional Bilingual Education Act in 1971. But all the schools that were created were run by Latino people. Their parents literally purchased things, cooked the meals, brought the chalk, all of that. Very much, a grassroots community control effort. They had, they named the Rafael Hernandez, which is the oldest bilingual school. And then the big issue was what was going to happen during busing. And the Latino community realized that no one had thought of them. And that was very evident because Garrity actually had a note in his decision that was like, we recognize there are other people here. And we recognize Latinos are largely with Black people, but we don't actually know how this is going to impact them. So we'll figure that out later. And what happened was that Latino parents in particular were concerned that if they didn't mobilize, all the bilingual ed programs were going to be destroyed because kids would be dispersed and then you wouldn't have enough to warrant a bilingual cluster. So ultimately what happened was that they realized that Latino people are diverse racially, and they didn't understand, the city didn't know how to racially classify them. The teachers would go and say, you're light-skinned, you're white, you're dark-skinned, you're Black. Let me see your hair, let me see your features. And teachers would just racially designate Latino children. And they were doing that so that they could also use them as pawns. They could use dark-skinned or Black Latino children to integrate certain schools, and then vice versa. So much so that even in families, they had family split where like one twin was sent to a Black school, one twin was sent to a white school because they were racially designated as different. Ultimately, they ended up being plaintiff interveners in the Garrity case. A group of parents mobilized and they advocated for Latinos to have their own racial category. Originally, they were the the defendants wanted to list them as Hispanic Black or Hispanic White. And then the plaintiffs in the case wanted to list them as other minorities. Both of those didn't suit, though, because they would ultimately destroy all the bilingual ed. So they won, and Garrity actually implemented all of their plans and saved all the bilingual ed. But it obviously is a longer story if you think about where Latinos are now and kind of the dissolution of bilingual ed in the early 2000s.
I want to move to talk a bit about the racial wealth gap. One of the main ideas of education is that it is the great equalizer. It is the thing that, if done correctly, will send a student to college or to a tech school of their choice, that can ultimately help them, put them on a path to gaining wealth, gaining a job, gaining things to set up their family. I want to run down some numbers that are specific to Boston, that look at the racial wealth gap. According to the Urban Institute estimate from 2022, I'm purposely choosing not to use that $8 figure here. White families in Boston have a net worth of $215,000. Black families, $11,000. Latino families, $6,000. Median household incomes, white families, $108,000. Black families, $64,000. Latino families, $61,000. When we look at home ownership, which is one of the key drivers to building wealth, white families in Boston, 68%. Black, 34%. Latino, 28%. You also look at business owners per capita in Boston. White, 117 per 1,000 people. Black, 87 per 1,000. And Latino, 76 per 1,000. And then you can also sort of point to home values as well, where Black and Latino Bostonians' homes are worth far less than white owned homes in Boston, and 18% less for Black homes and 14% less than Latino homes. So one of the things that we think of most when we look at the racial wealth gap is how did we get here? And obviously you can push things back to for at least Black people in Boston, or Black people in America, quite frankly, is slavery. But to look at now, how do we fix things going forward? How can we look at these numbers from the housing issues, from the business owner issues? How can we look at that, look at education, and say this is a possible solution? I'm going to open that to anyone who possibly wants to think about and talk about solutions here.
So Kris, you sketch out some pretty kind of eye-popping metrics for us to consider. And I think some of the challenge in thinking about the racial wealth gap in general is just the enormity of it. And there's a lot of contested data. And so, those of us here in Boston can definitely think back to the Color of Wealth report that was released by the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, in 2017. A piece of work that continues in terms of there's a group of entities that are working with the Fed now to issue a restudy, sort of an updated version of that report. And so on the steering committee with the Fed, I'm representing the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, but also the Boston Foundation is represented, as well as the Barr Foundation and the Eastern Bank Foundation. And so there is a commitment to coming back to those numbers that we looked at in 2017, and also saying kind of what do we know about these disparities between groups and within groups that speak to what is a generational wealth deficit. One of the big numbers that was put out to us was from McKinsey as well. And sort of McKinsey had projected that if we close all of the racial wealth gaps across the board, that we would be talking about an additional upwards of $1 trillion added to our GDP, which is represents about 4 to 6% of the overall GDP being increased by upwards of, again, $1 trillion by 2028. And so if you thought about that, based on discrimination, based on racist practices that extend through lending, for mortgages, people being denied mortgages. You saw the story today, I'm sure many of us did, around valuations and appraisals of homes. Once you get a home, is it undervalued? Do you have access to college education? Does that help you? Certainly Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley has been really outspoken in the need to forgive student loan debt and has delivered for us in many ways. One of the points that was highlighted in the Federal Reserve Bank's report in 2017 suggested that even if you're able to attain college level education, that the burden, not only of the burden of debt, provided an inverse relationship for most people of color who receive higher ed. So you have an inverse relationship between income and wealth. So say you get to college, you get the 4-year degree, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you are able to accumulate wealth. So what is that? And so what does it mean to be a person in your family who has had access to higher education? Oftentimes it means that in some ways you are vulnerable because you are an ATM. Sorry, but yeah, an ATM for your family. People need something for this person, for that. I mean, many of us, I see some heads nodding on the panel, we can relate to what that means. And so I mention this because we need to really critique and nuance some of these ideas about what it is that would close the racial wealth gap. And when we talk about education, what does that look like? We talk about home ownership. What does that mean when we all are sort of survived maybe the foreclosure crisis, when we saw what it looked like for the banks to be very liberal, quote unquote, in making available these toxic loans, which were devastating to many communities. And so whether it's home ownership or education, or even how we think about jobs, I think what you're offering us, Kris, is an opportunity to really complicate our understanding of not only the size and the enormity of the racial wealth gap, but these things that have been offered to us as strategies, as sure fixes, are not just that. I think it's really important to be engaged in community and to talk with folks about their lived experience. And Ron, thank you so much for sharing your own story of surviving a failed attempt to integrate schools here. These stories are painful, but we need to talk to people about how that has affected them and how has that affected your ability to be well, to be whole, because that is the basis of wealth. And so before we even talk about dollars and cents, we need to also talk about how our communities are coming into repair and healing. And so if you were to ask me, which is what you've asked, Kris, how do we think about strategies and approaches for tackling the racial wealth gap? We cannot ask any such question without being in deep conversation with community, with residents, with our institutions, with our grassroots organizations, with our faith-based institutions, with young people, because we're having a generational conversation which is deep and lasting, and it doesn't just get solved by giving everyone a college education, for example. It doesn't get solved by giving everyone a home per se. So there's a much deeper set of complicated ideas that have to be interrogated. And this conversation must include a discussion of reparations. And so if we're talking about harm that has gone back hundreds of years, we need to talk about how do we quantify that land loss? How do we quantify the unpaid labor? How do we quantify that? Because you're not just going to fix this with one policy, one program. It has to be a national overhaul. And if you didn't want to go as far back as what you suggest, Kris, to the beginning of enslavement in this country or even in this hemisphere, we could just talk about the harms brought in the 20th century through urban renewal clearances, through highway expansion, through the devastation of legal national policy. There's so much harm and there's so much to quantify that we definitely have our work cut out for us. And so this is a time to really be thinking strategically about solutions, and it must include a conversation about reparations, no question.
Can I just briefly add? I mean, yes, I'm 100% pro reparations, absolutely. But also reparations can look like a lot of things. I think a lot of people think it's just a one-time check to Black people who are descendants of formerly enslaved people, but it can look like a lot of things. And just if we're thinking practically of how to address the wealth gap here in Boston, I would say as a millennial, you could eliminate my loans. Canceling student loans would be a huge step. And honestly, they, in all the discussions of that loan relief, it was all about how it would impact women of color more than anyone, right? Canceling student loans. How about addressing the lack of affordable housing in Boston, the lack of opportunities to, pathways to be homeowners, right? Those are huge, real issues that are impacting. I mean, I think education is one piece, but I'm a mother of 3 and I live in Dorchester. And like many folks of color, we have left the Boston schools. And you can see actually mass numbers of African Americans in particular who have left Boston schools in the last decade, especially. So yeah, we need to fix that, right? That's a situation. As African Americans, Latinos, all folks will do what's best for their children, whether they participate in METCO, whether they opt into independent schools, whether they're following the charter school movement. Everyone's doing what they think is best for their kids, but fixing the schools is not going to fix everything, right? That's one step towards it. But I do think there's actual practical things that the city could do in the name of reparations, right, to actually help people. And I think, the inability to live in the city of Boston right now with the high cost of living, that's a huge step, because it doesn't matter how much money I make in my lifetime if I can never afford to live here, because it can't keep pace with the rise of cost of living.
Right. I'm glad, Kris, that you did not mention the $8 net worth of a Black family, because I think it's a lot lower. And that's why I do the work I do. As an organizer, as a political organizer, I go into every neighborhood and I see the disparity. I see sewers not clean. I see streets are not clean in Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, as opposed to South Boston and other neighborhoods that don't look like us. And so I try my best to engage people through voting and civic engagement. First, let's talk to each other. You go down south and you'll say hi. You're like, "Ooh, do you know me?" Boston's a cold city, and I'm not just talking about the weather. It's like people don't talk to each other. As I mentioned earlier, the Hacking the Archive racial wealth gap we had Saturday, to see people from different backgrounds coming together. I think that needs to happen. Let's face the truth. Let's call it what it is. It's racism. White folks have not wanted Black folks to be in schools with each other. Even in 1963, the year I was born, the March on Washington, 98,000 students were in the Boston Public School. Now it's 48,000. 49,000, mostly Latino. Blacks are not the folks I grew up with. They're in Brockton, Randolph. They're all over the state. I went to Brockton 2 weeks ago, and it was like it was Mission Hill. And so I think that we need to kind of like face our realities, deal with the situation that is at hand. When we talk about things that's going to affect the Black community, African Americans in particularly, it's always a pushback. You mentioned reparations. Oh, we can't do that. You mentioned Black history curriculum. Oh, we can't do this. Look at the George Floyd on a national level, which affects a George Floyd police reform bill. Why wasn't that an executive order? Why wasn't, the Voting Rights Act, John Lewis? Why isn't that not? This is all important. I've been trying to educate folks on how they can access services in City Hall, the State House, because right now people are not even interested in the election. I think that's a start. I don't think we should be closing schools, turning them into condominiums in the Black community. During busing, they were closing 20 schools in the Black community and shipping young kids out to white schools. So I think that we need to have a conversation and action and strategy.
Karilyn, you came off mute for a second. I wanted to give you a chance to say something.
Oh, sure. Ron was covering it so well. And I think Tatiana had also touched on this point around housing, not only the cost of housing, but to always be mindful of the fact that this conversation around desegregation in schools is based in the just durability of residential segregation, which is still the bedrock organizing order of the United States. And so our refusal to live side by side as a multiracial democracy, it dogs us. So we can talk about what's going on in schools, or we can talk about what's going on in job sites, but fundamentally, the fact that there is this lasting racial residential segregation, it will mean that we will always be in this return conversation to how can we get better schools, how can we get integrated schools, because we refuse to really think about very carefully what it would mean to actually allow for full-bodied residential integration. And then how can we think differently about our feeling around housing as a commodity, housing as part of the speculative market is something that is actually made worse by racial segregation, which we still live in this moment of racial segregation by residents, even though it is illegal. And so that is part of the issue here. We still have not dealt with the fact that we are in a moment of a housing crisis, which has been mentioned. That was also true in the 1950s and 60s in Boston. Even as many white people were starting to move out of the city, there was an increase of Latinx and Black communities and immigrant populations coming into the city in the 60s and 70s. And that pressure to provide quality housing for these communities was never fully addressed, despite dazzling and incredibly creative and incredibly powerful organizing on the ground. And so I wanted to just mention that. And then the fact that Ron has made this reference to this project that we're working on called Hacking the Archive. I just wanted to say one word about that, if I could. In this project, what we're really trying to foreground is this longer history of organizing that has been a part of our legacies as legacy populations, as people of color in the city, as working class people, as sort of multiracial organizers. Folks have been working on these issues around economic justice, around housing justice, around education for a very long time. These issues are not new. And the best thing we can do for ourselves is allow these stories and these histories to be circulated, to be shared, to be ingested deeply, and to be recognized as a critical part of our ability to understand the future. So how can we understand past moments of promise, past moments of fight, of looking into the future, and allowing that to really inform what we do, and to recognize that many of the answers that we are looking for and that we need are right here in community. And so Hacking the Archive is a project that's really bringing together across generational set of folks together, young people, students, activists, archivists, faith-based leaders, nonprofit leaders who are saying, we have the questions and we have the answers too. And how can our history and archival stories and research be used to help us really take full ownership of what the future, not only of our neighborhoods and our organizations can be, but what is the future plan for the city that we can create ourselves, informed by the incredible wealth of our own stories and our own determination and fight for something that's different from what the future that's being offered to us is. So we are very much in a future that people were trying to resist. People were trying to resist this moment of crisis, but we're still talking about racial integration because they thought they could have solved it 50 years ago, and they could have. People were pushing for a future where we're not still talking about a housing crisis, because that's what they were trying to address in the 60s. Even by stopping a highway, they felt like they were trying to make sure the people who lived in the city could stay there. And so we're in this repetitive cycle that can actually be broken, not by waiting for a bank or someone to write a check, or for a superhero from outer space to come and save us, but by really listening to ourselves and our own history, and resolving ourselves to the wealth which is already embedded in community. And so that's a big part of what we're working on. But I feel like we all know this is true. And so really need a way to really step into that more fully, because I do believe that we have the answers right at our fingertips, and just need to believe it and step into it.
And the important piece about that is to know our history. As I mentioned earlier, looking at the timeline and to connect it to my lived experience, it was like mind blowing. And I'm one of the advisors of Hacking the Archive, and I was asked to be a judge. And when I was in the group, I believe the second group that talked about busing and desegregation, I got so entrenched and connected to it that I couldn't even leave. And and I think about all my friends and my brothers, my sisters. I can't wait to share this with them. Um, we lived it, but we never thought about it. We never knew. Because remember, I was 11 years old, and to see what's going on now and to look at the history, many folks say, we've come a long way. We haven't come. We may have come. It may have been a lot of years, but we haven't gone that far as progress.
I also want to go to a question that sort of touches on something you, Ron, and Karilyn briefly mentioned. I'm just going to read this question from Boya J. Farah. Part of my mispronunciation if I'm not saying that correctly. Boston knows it's a racist place, that Black people are leaving, and yet Boston remains in denial. We Black educated people in Boston often advise each other to leave Boston. Almost all of my educated Black friends left Boston. If Boston is in denial, what hope do you see for Black people to remain in Boston? And I wanted to open that question to either Karilyn or Ron, because I know both of you briefly mentioned this in a back and forth a little bit ago.
For someone who grew up in Boston, I love Boston. It's a beautiful city, but under that beauty, you have racism, you have you have all these problems, homelessness, gentrification, and all that. But Boston sometimes don't like me back. And it's like a family. You can talk about this one or that one, but don't talk about my family. And so we always try to put this imagination that Boston is so great, but I think we need to acknowledge our problems. And again, I have to go back to, we have to get involved in the political process, and it can't just be local. It has to be regional, because all the folks I grew up with are all over the state. And even the Boston, I think Tatiana talked about how people are moving. It's not because they want to leave. They can't afford the housing. They're not welcome in spaces. When I worked for Governor Deval Patrick, I was going into spaces I'd never even been in. CEOs of New England and, all these places that I never even heard of. And here I am, a kid from Mission Hill that didn't even know. So I can imagine the folks that I grew up with, they don't even experience some of that. And again, I thought about this. My mother was a bus monitor. And we didn't even know what that meant. She's one of the founding members of Roxbury to Harvard, and, an activist. I guess that's what I get that fire in my belly. And my dad was like George Jefferson and Fred Sanford. You remember that? He was like the guy who was a community person. And they never shared this information with me, even though we were living it. We didn't know what poverty was. We did not know what it was, because there was always food on the table. The school was closed. I had the fortune of going to Boston Latin, but misfortune of being discriminated against and, to feel the pain. So when we talk about this subject, it's like closed lips, tight lips of Black people from Boston.
I think for me, it's really important to understand that there has been an incredible legacy of resistance and people refusing to wait. I was sort of sitting here thinking a little bit about the Chinese Exclusion Act, even, and the way that sort of act itself really affected the formation of Chinatown in Boston and elsewhere. I was thinking about Mum Bet in the 1700s fighting for her own freedom to articulate that in Massachusetts as a woman who was fighting for her own self-determination and freedom. I was also thinking about some of the fights for Via Victoria and Parcel 19, and folks were really taking on to them for themselves as Puerto Rican residents, saying we will define for ourselves. And so in all of these stories, for me, the cut through is communities saying we will not be subservient to laws or to people who would deny us. And so when you talk about, Kris, the reality of sort of the history of racism in Boston or anywhere else in the United States, for me, what is really resonant and important to hold on to is all of the communities here who have been so steadfast in creating place, creating identity, and creating a way to be for themselves and their families, despite the racist structures that we all live in. So very important to lift that up, and particularly for me as well. My family came to Boston in the 1950s from West Virginia. They experienced an incredibly hostile place. They were thinking that they were leaving a very difficult area in West Virginia, leaving the coal mines to enter freedom and possibility. They did not get that here. They did not get more educational opportunity, more housing, or more. It was horrible for them and so many other families. And so what I take from that is this resistance fight. And so my grandmother, again, deciding to join other women and sue the school committee, that is really instructive for how populations here have been extremely resilient, persistent, visionary, and creative in the face of unimaginable odds. And so I would not allow the colonial story or the racist story just to be the only story that's told, because the fire that has been breathed and forged for all of us is what gives us sort of staying power, and also allows so many people in the rest of the country and all over the world even to look to Boston in terms of how populations of color and immigrant folks have really articulated very different notions of what democracy can be like, and not in terms of just sort of patriotic pablum, but really forcing the laws to often be changed to make sure that there is ground for people to walk on because they have articulated as their birthright, which it is.
This question is actually, Boston needs to have a realization and acknowledgement in the way that it treats its Black population. And I also want to add to its Latino population in this instance. To add to the question that this person is asking, what is the possibility of that acknowledgement of happening in Boston? I think part of the question too, to both of your points, Ron and Karilyn, is that acknowledgement has to happen for people to want to continue to be here. So Tatiana, I wanted to bring that question to you as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think an acknowledgement is important, but it's just a first step. I mean, and there was someone that's great who actually asked questions about how do Asian and Asian Americans fit in this conversation. So I'd throw them in there too, right? And there's actually great research now on how Asian Americans lobbied for their own interests during the busing case, as well as how they joined a lot of Latinx and other groups towards creating more bilingual education in the late 70s and 80s. Now the situation is different, right? Like the Asian American population, just like the Latinx population, it really depends on who you're talking about. And I think when we think about Boston, it's a global city. Even the numbers you were mentioning, Kris, about how much people own in terms of wealth, like if you aggregate those, what you see is that there's a lot of Black Latinx folks in Boston, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. You know, the average wealth of Dominicans in Boston is $0, right? So everyone's very obsessed with the $8 figure, but we're talking like $0 for Dominicans, right? And then the Black population is actually largely not African American. It's largely Haitian now. We have Cape Verdeans, right? And in terms of the Asian population, right, we have a huge divide between you know, a lot of East Asian groups, particularly middle and upper class folks who are, for example, leading the fight against Boston Latin right now, and took it all the way to the Supreme Court to advocate for, their rights, feeling that they were discriminated against in new admissions policies to admit more African American Latinx students, right? But then there's also, a lot of poor Asian groups. For example, in my neighborhood, we have a lot of Vietnamese and different groups that are, essentially having the same experience of race in Boston as African Americans, right? We all live in the same kind of area and the kids go to the same schools and they still live in poverty, right? So, I mean, I think an acknowledgement is just a first step. I think the reality is like we need to address these very specific, and you can't just address populations without the specificities of what those populations need, right? If history teaches us anything, African Americans don't want the same thing that Latinx folks, and Latinx folks don't agree on anything within each other anyways, right? Asian Americans, right? These are all groups with specific histories and specific needs and wants, right? I read a great article in the Globe a couple years ago about how it was a Chinese mother complaining to Boston Public Schools because their child had been assigned like a one-on-one para who didn't speak Chinese. And it was part of their accommodations in terms of language. And, you know, it really needs to be specific and cater to the community. So I'd like to think that, you know, that is just a first step. I think there's a lot of efforts to document the history of Boston now that's trying to hold everyone accountable. I think with every election, we try and do that. I know many folks were very pleased with the election of Mayor Wu, right? Being the first woman and the first woman of color elected. And a lot of folks were very upset that we still haven't elected the first Black mayor, right? We are one of the only major cities in this country who have never elected a Black mayor. And what does that teach us, right? After generations and generations and folks running for mayor and got so close with Mel King in 1983 and, you know, so close. But in fact, we've actually never elected one. So does that mean that Boston's more comfortable with non-white, but also non-Black groups like, you know, Asian Americans and other, and, you know, light-skinned Latinx folks? I think there's just a lot to unpack here, but I think, yeah, an acknowledgement is just the beginning.
Someone asked, how can Asians and Asian Americans and other ethnicities not distinctly represented or mentioned here be a part of the solution or the conversation, if not the solution? I know we talk about we've talked about here the idea of needing to make sure we have these conversations to be able to fix some of the issues that we see.
Part of this point that Tatiana was just making is putting an underscore, at least for me, on the durability of anti-Black racism in this country as sort of a historic organizing force, sort of the way that anti-Black racism functions to organize space, to organize economic decisions, to organize policy, is something that we have to continue to interrogate and not let off the off the hook. And so when we talk about multiracial solidarities with Latin communities, with Asian communities, with Indigenous communities, it is all recognizing the fact that anti-Black racism is a systemic and a structural issue. It's not about any particular population, and we can all be in solidarity there. Certainly in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, if anything, many of us sort of really can remember this sort of uprising on the street among folks of the movement for Black Lives to really bring attention not only to police brutality and not only sort of sounding the alarm in a discussion about defunding the police, as in Minneapolis and elsewhere, but a conversation that was really trying to force a renewed attention on anti-Black racism. And so to know that that is such a critical part of how, again, government is organized, private sector is organized, school systems are organized, just in our cultural consciousness and in our policies. Until that root is plucked out, I think all of us are vulnerable. And so that's a really key point that I would offer to the question, but also, again, just coming back to what Tatiana was offering, because we cannot just turn away from it. And now we're in a moment where, as Ron was saying, the Black history is being outlawed, not to mention of the perversion of thinking that critical race theory is problematic. These conversations about DEI being plucked out and thrown off of campuses, thrown out of corporations. It's just all the way backward. And not to say that DEI was solving it, but now we can't even talk about these things. Forget having a real intentional investigation of what our history has been and continues to be. So without that piece of it, the future looks even more bleak. And so again, a call here to double down on our understanding of what this legacy is, but also just the perniciousness of anti-Black racism is something that can kill us all, and it just might.
I think the question is like, right, initially, how can other groups be involved in this conversation? I mean, as a non-Black person of color, I absolutely think my job is to tackle racism and anti-Black racism specifically. I mean, I teach Africana Studies. I specialize in African American history. And I think that until these groups can understand the anti-Black sentiments within their own communities, right, they can't be good allies. I mean, my work really looks at coalition building. So I look at all the moments where African Americans and Latinxes in particular, although we could add other groups in there, have organized for social change together, right? And they formed alliances. So if you look at the history of Boston, there have been alliances over fair housing and tenants' rights where African American Latinx came together, right? There have been rent strikes. There have been all these anti-poverty organizations that emerged in the post-war era were largely because of coalition building, right? It was people that, it was the Roxbury Multi-Service Center first, and then they helped create La Alianza Hispana, right? Or there were, coalitions built in the struggle for welfare rights, right? Where African-American, Latinx, and white moms came together to fight for welfare rights. And so I do think that if we have a fuller understanding of history, we look at the kind of radical potential of coalition building. And I think as somebody who lives in this city and lives in a largely African-American population community, I think I aspire to build coalitions that actually materialize into change. But it does take work, right? It takes complicated work to understand where your role is, where your privileges are, and how you can use those, as well as, understanding how to work across difference, right? That different communities require different things, and they're going to advocate for different things at different times. And how can you support simultaneously, even if you don't have the exact same needs or exact same mission? So I think going forward, kind of looking at Boston as a multiracial city and a global city, I think honestly the power would come when these groups do a better job aligning with African Americans and think about the potential to come together, right? Because if these groups were doing a better job, we would have already elected a Black mayor, right? Because we would have seen that was the best thing for Boston. But how many Latinx and Asian and other non-Black groups are willing to elect a Black mayor? Those are just questions that we have to keep thinking about.
And also, I think that we got to recognize that folks thought that we're monolithic. We have different groups in the Black community. You have Haitian, Trinidadian, Dominican, and so forth, Cape Verdean. And we have to make sure we get to know each other and to talk and to organize together. And sometimes I get a little disturbed at the fact that we talk about people of color, because what happens when I look at, the African American community, people of color are not in that equation when it comes to distributing resources. And the African American community. So I think we need some healing, we need some discussion, conversation, but more or less we need action. I had mentioned earlier that I didn't meet Latinos until the 7th, 8th grade, 9th grade probably, and I didn't meet Asians probably in the 5th grade. And the only reason why I met an Asian because Michael Wong, I'll never forget his name, an Asian young man, Chinese, kicked my behind. He put jitsu and kung fu and karate all in one, and he became my friend. I said, you hanging with the Black kids. So it was just all these changes have happened over the years, and I think we need to really revisit our history.
Someone asks in the chat, who, whether it be an individual, community group, company, is doing good work or a good job at the work that you all are talking about? Karilyn, you mentioned there's not one individual, I guess, Superman type person that can come down and fix it all, but who in the community is doing good work to examine and to acknowledge and reconfigure and fix some of these things?
Sure. I wanted to ask you that question, Kris, because you have done such powerful investigative journalism and sort of giving a sense of what's going on in the city. So would love for you to weigh in here a little bit too. For me, the Boston Ujima Project comes to mind immediately. I also think about BECMA, the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, as two organizations that really have taken up the challenge of redefining the path to economic justice. And so the racial wealth gap and then some, really borrowing from, I would say, Black and Black diasporic traditions of sharing resources. This is not new. The idea of a solidarity economy, even I think about the work of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, now under the leadership of John Smith, and the power of land trusts as examples of, again, shared resourcing. How can collectivist approaches to survival and to thriving be made available? In the example of the Boston Ujima Project, we're talking about the first democratically governed investment fund in the United States. That is not small. That's coming out of a very particular moment of recognizing people in Boston, in Dorchester, in Roxbury, in Mattapan, really saying, you know what, we can figure this out. We can take our own dollars, create our own fund to invest in businesses that are here or businesses that we want to exist or other kinds of initiatives that we want to direct. We're not waiting for the government. We're not waiting for a community development corporation to decide. We ourselves, as a fund of people who live here, can make investments and can direct our own pathway. So really powerful examples of, again, people on the ground deciding their path, but also economic vehicles that are available to them. Similarly, BECMA, this example of not only resistance, but creative problem solving that is made possible by people who are doing the work and understand that the work and the commitment is a long haul fight. I will just finish by saying that in thinking about the racial wealth gap again, it is really crucial that we remember that Boston is a wealthy city. We have been a very wealthy city for a very long time. This as one of the hubs of the transatlantic slave trade, both shipping, sending ships out, bringing people in. Boston has an incredible history of wealth building from that time through the rise of services and education and rethinking what the economy looks like in the 1960s. We continue to gain wealth. And so I think it was 2014 or 2015 when the Brookings Institute had called Boston the most unequal city, economically unequal city in the United States, as because of the wealth divide. And so when we talk about the racial wealth gap, again, remembering that we are in a place where there is tremendous wealth. So there is an invitation for us to rethink how that wealth is marshaled, is distributed and redistributed. And I think that the Ujima Project and also BECMA are just tremendous examples of how to do that. Conversations about land trust, limited equity co-ops, all of these models are not new, but there's an opportunity here for us to think about how to bring these things to scale. And so I still will hold my pivot, Kris, because I'm looking at you and would love to see if you'd be willing to share, maybe tip your journalist hands on some of the stuff you've seen as you've been reporting around the city.
I mean, I would love to, but we only have 1 minute left.
Nice dodge.
I want to make sure that everyone here on this panel gets a chance to answer this question.
Yeah.
Tatiana or Ron, if you had a chance.
Yeah, I was going to say, go out and vote September 5th, November. Let's get involved in the election. I think the power to vote can really start to change things. Massachusetts had the lowest turnout, according to I forgot the foundation, as far as the Black turnout out of 32 states. And we continue to organize, we continue to mobilize so that we can get some power. We had the fortunate opportunity to be with Dr. G. McGuire at the hackathon, and that's all she talked about. We need to run for office. We need to get young people involved. Some of us are getting a little up in age, and we can't continue to do this work by ourselves. So we need to train our young leaders, Black, white, Latino, and everything in between, to come together and to change the narrative.
Thanks, everyone. So that is our time. I wanted to thank everyone on the panel, Dr. Tatiana Cruz, Dr. Karilyn Crockett, and Ron Bell. And I just want to take it back to you, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kris. Thank you for your hosting, moderating this conversation. Thank you to the panel. What a wonderful conversation.